Thank you. This is entitled A Mother's Day Prayer by the Reverend Tess Baumberger. Whether or not we are mothers, we all have mothers. Mothers whose bodies nurtured our bodies as they emerged in the darkness. Mothers whose thoughts and feelings swirled through the currents of the womb. Mothers whose oxygen breathed into us and helped root our souls into this world. However they nurtured us after, we all had that deep body connection with our biological mothers before birth. Motherhood runs deeply throughout our lives, as do our feelings about mothering. The mothers of some of us here have passed in the last several years. As we breathe together, let us breathe comfort into the hearts of those children who mourn their mothers. There are mothers here whose children have passed, or whose children are lost behind the walls of estrangement which life sometimes places between mothers and children. As we breathe together, let us breathe comfort into the hearts of those mothers who mourn their children. There are women here who have always wanted to be mothers, but whose lives never presented them that opportunity. As we breathe together, let us breathe reassurance into the hearts of mothers whose children take different forms, accomplishments, acts of creativity and love, workings of the Spirit. There are those among us who have troubled pasts with our mothers, and those who have troubled presents or futures with our mothers. And as we breathe together, let us breathe strength and hope into the hearts of those whose connections to their mothers have twists that sometimes cause pain and sometimes distress. And there are those among us who celebrate this day with mothers who are strong, loving, guiding forces. Mothers who taught us to laugh, to sing, to cry, to think, to feel, to work, to play, to love, and to live. And as we breathe together, let us breathe the gladness and joy of motherhood at its best. Motherhood that nurtures in ways that can't be seen, motherhood whose deep connections continue to feed our souls with the breath, the blood, the loving currents of life. So, quick show of hands. How many of you have read Little Women? More than once? I won't go any further. For those of you who haven't, I would apologize, but I don't feel all that apologetic. I'm sorry. I don't know how old I was when I first read it. I've read the book many times. But I do remember a feeling, even now after all these decades, I can't really describe. It's as though somebody had put a warm shawl gently around my shoulders. Something in that book gave me a courage and hope that I hadn't felt before. Something in that book felt like it was written just for me. Even today, it became a runaway, huge bestseller in its time. Louisa May Alcott was by far the most published author of her day, male or female. Even today, more than 1,000 copies are still sold every month. And this is many, obviously, century and a half later. Now, the funny thing, I mean, there are many interesting things about this story, but the funny thing that I didn't know until I was preparing to share this message with you today is that she really, 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 really did not want to write the book. She had a publisher whose name was Thomas Niles, who had made a pretty penny from all of her melodramatic stories. Pretty spicy, I have to say, for the most part. They were filled with like femme fatale women who broke the hearts of men right and left, and we might even call them bodice rippers today if we had the nerve. And her publisher, as I said, had really made quite a profit from her work. And for some reason, we don't know why, for some reason, Thomas Niles turned to her and said, "I want you to write a book for girls." And she said, "No, I really don't want to." He said, "Don't you think," she told him, "don't you think I've earned the right to write whatever I want at this point?" And he said, "Write a book for girls." She said, "No." Then he came back to her a while later with a very convincing bribe. He said, "If you write this book, I will publish your father, Bronson Alcott, I will publish his book, Tempest, which it's a philosophical treatise which nobody else wants to publish. I'll publish his book if you write this book for me." And I can imagine her rolling her eyes and going, "All right." So, having agreed to write the book, she found every excuse on the planet not to start. Now, she had been a very disciplined and very hardworking writer. She couldn't find her way to starting this book. So one of her biographers, Susan Cheevers, describes this scene, a summer in Concord where the Alcotts had lived on and off for a period of time. It was a beautiful summer day. Louisa set out in the morning with a very long list of errands, which she figured would, be a great excuse not to begin writing that day. And unfortunately for her, she got the errands finished a bit early enough to go back home. And she decided, if you've been to Orchard House, you know that there's a little room sort of high up with her desk in it. She went up to her room and she sat at her desk and conjured up happy memories of her past. She remembered visiting Thoreau in his hut on Walden Pond, and she remembered raiding the library of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And then she remembered a Christmas of many years past. And she wrote the sentence, "Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents," grumbled Joe. "It's so hard to be poor," added Meg. And with that first sentence of the book, she began writing and couldn't stop. Her father, Bronson, when his 4 daughters had been born, had called them the Golden Band. And in that moment, she decided that this book would be about the Golden Band. Joe March, kind of a stand-in for Louisa, would be the rebellious one with a very plain face and a bad temper. But she would be the leader of the band, and Meg would be the ladylike one, and Amy would be the prissy artist. And Beth would be the sister who was always happy with what she had. And she wrote and wrote and wrote, and 6 weeks later, she sent a 400-page manuscript to her publisher. She thought it was dull. He thought so too, but he published it anyway. And you know the rest of the story. It touched not just my heart, but literally millions of other hearts, and became something that even I will say, from my more elderly standpoint, it's even still rare today to find a heroine who's not very well behaved, who's plain, who's willful and stubborn and has a bad temper, and still finds a way to make a life of really great meaning and success. The book, as I just said, still finds its readers. Louisa's life was very hard. And in many ways, until recent years, we've not had kind of the full picture of what her parents were like. It was believed until about 10 years ago that Louisa had burned, at her mother's request, had burned all of her mother's journals and all of her writings. And so the people who wrote about her, her biographers, said she was really her father's daughter, that he was the one who nurtured her gift, and he was the one who inspired her with his great theories of education and his brilliant mind. Well, as it turns out, one of her great-great-grandnieces, Eve LaPlante, took a different route and found a treasure trove of her mother Abigail's journals. And I'm personally really glad she did, because we now know much more about what their lives were. Abigail was a devout Unitarian. She went to church every Sunday. Surprise, surprise, she was willful. She was opinionated. She was an abolitionist. She was a feminist. She was a champion of education, which one might expect from one of our Unitarian ancestors. And she was also profoundly constrained by the society of the early 19th century that granted women in this country very, very few rights. Abigail refused to marry any of the suitable potential husbands her father introduced her to. She said, I won't marry until I fall in love, and I won't marry if I don't. Well, she met Bronson Alcott, who from all accounts was charismatic and articulate and very intelligent and everything that somebody might want. And so she fell in love with him and she married him, and her father was very distressed because he said, yes, he's a sweet talker, but he's never made any money. And that would be a pattern that Bronson would faithfully maintain for the rest of his life. He never made any money. True story. Until after Little Women was published and he got famous and his lecture tours started to pay because everybody wanted to hear about his famous daughter, which he enjoyed enormously, by the way, doing those lecture tours. Abigail married him, and to the end of her journals, appears to have still remained in love with him, although later on she did say that it was easier to love him when he wasn't home. Was that tactful enough? They had a hard life. They didn't have money. They depended on handouts from her family, from their transcendentalist friends like Emerson and Thoreau. They depended on friends giving them places to live. They moved 30 times in the first 30 years of their marriage. At one point, Bronson accepted an invitation to go to England because he had admirers there who were promising to, I guess, provide him with some funding. And he came back with a man by the name of Charles Lane, who had a lot of money, which sounds very hopeful. And they bought a plot of land and started a utopian community not far from Concord called Fruitlands. Fruitlands was, in many ways, a pretty disastrous experiment. Charles, who some theorize had become Bronson's lover, Bronson and Charles set very strict rules. There were to be no animal products worn or eaten. They talked philosophy, and Abigail and her young daughters did all the work, including the planting and the reaping of crops. Bronson also dictated that for purity, for spiritual purity, He and Abigail would remain celibate for the rest of their lives. Yeah, that's what she thought. And we have every reason to believe that that remained the case. And it was she writes in her journal, it was a real blow to her. Abigail and her daughters were hungry, they were cold, they lost weight, their health deteriorated. Charles Lane did not like Abigail, he disrespected her, and she began a process of working herself to the bone, something that eventually cost her her health. And one day, she said to Bronson, I don't know about you, but I'm taking my kids and I'm taking them home. And you can stay here as long as you want. She had found a friend who would host her and her children, and sometime later, Bronson did come back to them. But it was possibly the one time that she felt she had to do something to save her children. I've described a woman who had a strong intellect and strong thoughts about how the world should be. You saw maybe in the order of service where I put her a quote from her saying, I so wish I could leave my daughters a just world. She taught them to be strong, intellectually strong, spiritually strong, physically strong. They worked very hard. They worked as domestics from the time they were 8, 9 years old. They were seamstresses, domestics, tutors. The daughters and their mother supported the family for many, many years. And they supported one another. Louisa's sister May became an artist. She eventually died in Paris, where her art was recognized, and she had a newborn child when she died, and Louisa took that child and raised her until she was in her teens. Louisa was a very generous person. Abigail's example would not be an example that I would want to watch, my own mother suffering to that point, but in other ways, she taught the values that at least I hear and see in the book, Little Women. Responsibility and integrity and a passion for life and education. Louisa writes in her journal later in life, after she'd written Little Women and she was raising her young niece, she kept trying to hire governesses to help, and they were all just too stuffy or too, I don't know, whatever, but they were all of them unsuitable. And one young woman was coming in for an interview one day, and she saw Louisa and her niece roughhousing and rolling around on the floor and shrieking with laughter, right? And this young woman said, oh, this is outrageous. I could never work here. You are heathens. But it's a beautiful image, right? And it gives me a sense of who these women were and who these women became. When Louisa realized that she was older, she could make more money selling one story than she could make as a domestic in 3 months. She began to write her melodramas and eventually Little Women. I asked us at the beginning of the service today, or I invited us to honor our imperfect mothers and to honor ourselves as imperfect mothers. Abigail May Alcott is one of the mothers of our faith, who has received no credit for how she shaped her children, how she gave us strong women with a strong legacy. I hope to give her a little bit of credit today. With all of her imperfections, she holds a place of affection in my heart. Louisa took care of her. Abigail was blind by the time and very feeble. The work had truly taken it out of her. Louisa took care of her. Louisa took care of her father. Louisa herself volunteered to be a nurse in the Civil War and served in a hospital in Washington, D.C., where she contracted typhoid, as so many soldiers did in our Civil War. She was treated with mercury, as so many people were. And while she recovered, she lost her physical strength for the rest of her life. And the chances are that what took her life were the results of mercury poisoning. But among other things, she is honored on her gravestone in Concord as a veteran of this country. Amen, dear ones. Ashe, and blessed be.